Okay, you're good to go.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is Laurie Heskett. I'm a managing director with Moradia Group, a consulting firm out in the far suburbs of Philadelphia, Westchester, not that that matters in a Zoom environment. But in my spare time, I co-host or co-lead WIN's events committee with Maxine Dotson. And on behalf of the WIN board and the events committee, I wanted to welcome everyone here today. Today we partner with the Hartford Funds to bring you the timely topic of the election and its impacts on investments, a topic we've been looking forward to for months. Hartford Funds has been a sponsor since 2015 and have co-hosted a number of events in the last 5 years with WIN. With every event, there's a few folks that really go above and beyond to make the event possible. There's a lot of meetings, a lot of coordination ahead of time. And some special thank yous for this event go out to Julie Wilcox, Ann Davey, and Walter Garger. We wouldn't be here today without you and your idea to bring this event to the group. Since 2007, WIN has been promoting education and cross-industry networking in our region. Our members have diverse backgrounds, from portfolio managers to accountants, from operations technology folks, attorneys, plan sponsors. What we all share is an appreciation for both learning something new and for the value of networking. Cross-industry events like this, I think, are rare and a great opportunity to meet peers outside one's firm. A couple of housekeeping items. I think we're all Zoom experts by now, but make sure that your name is something that you'd like to be called. When we break into the networking groups, that'll be important. All attendees will be muted during the presentation. It helps keep background noise to a minimum. In terms of questions, please put your questions in the chat box in Zoom, and our moderator, Walter, is going to take a look at the questions during the event and try to incorporate them into a session, or potentially maybe pose them to our speakers at the end. Our agenda is pretty simple today. After some introductions, we're going to run the program until about 5:30, including the Q&A. From there, we're going to break into these networking groups, and if you're new to Zoom, it's pretty cool.
Ladies and gentlemen, I have here the decision of our distinguished judge.
Colleen Wortley, our Oz behind the scenes, is going to create these random breakout groups. I'm surprised at how much I actually have enjoyed these random meetings. When we're in person, we'd often kind of purposely find our friends, but with these random groups, it's really a great opportunity to meet somebody new. There's no format. You'll be surprised at how quickly the 12 minutes goes by. Just introduce yourself, and you'll be prompted when the room is about to end. A couple of upcoming events before you go. October 13th, Lincoln Financial is bringing us Courageous Leaders. We've got a couple of women who will share their career stories, appropriately named, in a TED Talk-like format. October 28th, we're doing something new. We're kind of kicking off a young professionals kind of subgroup of WIN, and we're going to bring a career carousel to help them learn the wide diversity of paths that they can take. And November 12th, we have an opportunity to talk about the COVID effect and what its impact has been on our investments, our portfolio, and our lives and work as we know it. We would be remiss if we didn't thank all of our sponsors, right? Our sponsors do more than maybe is always visible. They provide ideas, they provide speakers, they work with us, you know, to actually coming up with the ideas is sometimes the hardest part. In a non-COVID environment, they also provide us places to meet and sometimes food and drink. It's the sponsors that sponsorship and that partnership that really are what make WIN what it is. Let's see. And with that, I'm going to introduce our moderator for tonight. Walter Garger is General Counsel for Hartford Funds and has been at the Hartford for over 25 years. He oversees the legal team and he manages the relationship with the board. He plays a key role working with both industry groups and regulatory bodies. And the women that nominated Walter describe him as a mentor and champion for the women at Hartford. And now I'll hand it over to Walter. Thank you.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone, and thank
You're muted.
I think Walter,
You're muted.
Okay,
You're back.
I'm back, so I'll start over again. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you, Lori, for the introduction. I want to just say, first off, on behalf of Hartford Funds, we are thrilled to continue to sponsor the Women in Investing network. We think it's a tremendous group, and we enjoy the sponsorship very much. I'm honored today to be the moderator for this presentation. I think we're going to have a very interesting conversation about the upcoming elections and to some extent the impact they might have on investments. First thing I want to do is introduce our speakers for today. First off is Ann Davey. Ann is the Associate Director of Government Affairs, Federal Government Affairs for the Hartford. She resides in the Hartford's Washington, D.C. office, right in the thick of everything. And in her role, she advocates on behalf of the Hartford's businesses with Congress, federal agencies, and the administration. Prior to joining the Hartford, Ann was a vice president at the Bank Policy Institute, and prior to that had several different advocacy roles with the Financial Services Roundtable. Ann's a graduate of High Point University, where she majored in political science and minored in finance. So pleased to have Ann with us today. Our second speaker is Kathleen Melody. Kathleen is a Senior Government Affairs Officer for the Investment Company Institute, ICI. Prior to ICI, Kathleen served as Head of Federal Affairs at the Hartford in Washington, D.C., and she was responsible for leading that team in its advocacy efforts for all of the Hartford's businesses. Prior to her role at the Hartford, Kathleen served in the Obama White House, where she was a special assistant to the president and Senate liaison to the banking on banking and finance issues. Prior to that, Kathleen served as Deputy Assistant Secretary for Legislative Affairs in the U.S. Treasury Department. So Kathleen has lots of experience in financial and investment issues. Kathleen is a graduate of Georgetown University and George Mason School of Law. So those are our speakers today. The other thing I wanted to mention is we thought it would be fun to do a poll. Obviously, lots of polling going on with the elections coming up. We thought it'd be fun to do our own little mini poll. And we're going to ask you each 3 questions that we'd like you to respond to. And I'm going to read the questions now, but you'll have an opportunity to respond at the end or towards the end of the presentation. We will tally the results, and I will describe them to you at the end and see where we came out. So the first question is, who do you plan to vote for in the presidential election? President Trump, former Vice President Biden, or someone else? Question 2, who do you think will win the election? President Trump or former Vice President Biden? And question 3, I'm sure not everyone in attendance today is a Pennsylvania resident, but we thought the vast majority probably were. So we thought it'd be interesting to get your thoughts on who will win in Pennsylvania. It's obviously a big and important swing state, and both candidates are vying heavily for it. So we thought it'd be interesting if you thought President Trump or former Vice President Biden would win in Pennsylvania. So that's our poll. Please respond to that, and we'll tally up the votes at the end. And right now, I think we'll hand it to Ann and to Kathleen to go through their slides.
Great, thank you, Walter. I think Colleen's going to tee up the poll for us, and then I'll jump to our slides in just a second. All right, everyone should see the poll in front of them now, and I should make the important disclaimer that all of this is anonymous. We're just going to get some group results at the end. All right, we'll give everyone another minute to answer the poll. I think Colleen knows how many people we have in attendance and what it's going to look like when most people have answered the poll, if they choose to answer the poll. Before we kick off our formal agenda, I just want to give a little disclaimer for both Kathleen and myself. Our Hartford team, Government Affairs, works in a nonpartisan manner, and I know Kathleen and her team at ICI also work in a bipartisan manner. So all these election topics can get fairly charged. We're just here to provide some insight based on data, years of experience, and just some trends that may be of interest to this group in both the investment space and the general policy space. But my running joke that I say is that we're forecasting, not predicting, kind of like the local weather station. Everyone can be wrong about the weather, but they still get to keep their job and no one really holds them to it. That's that kind of thing. We're going to aim for more accuracy than that, but we'll do a little forecasting here today on the election. So thanks everyone for joining us. I think we will wrap up the poll in just a second and get started.
And we're actually good to go. Everybody responded.
Perfect. Thanks, everyone. All right, so here's just a quick agenda of what we're going to cover today. I'm going to start with the current environment and just quickly move on to the election, where we'll spend the bulk of our time. That's the fun stuff. Then we're going to hit on some investing specific policy issues that might be of interest to this group, given your job and the WIN Network's background, and just what impact the election may have on those issues. And then, as both Lori and Walter noted, we're going to do some moderated Q&A at the end there. So with that, Kathleen, I'm going to kick it over to you to talk a little bit about the breakdown of Congress and what that means for the legislative environment.
Great. Thanks, Anne, and thanks, Walter, for the nice introduction. So here we have a nice little graphic on the makeup of Congress. I think we all know, if we pay attention to the news at all, that Washington is divided. Congress has obviously worked under a divided government in the past, but I think we all feel that the atmosphere today is a little bit more partisan and broken than it has been before. But just to kind of go through the facts, Democrats hold the majority in the House with 235 members. 218 is what's needed to have the majority there. There are 2 vacancies for Republican members that have left. And in the Senate, the Republicans hold the majority with 53. Standard, simple majority of 51 votes gives them the majority. The 2 yellow dots there are independents that caucus with the Democrats, so they count towards their totals. And being in the majority really does matter. If you are the majority, you have the gavel in committees, you set the agenda in committees, and Speaker Pelosi and Leader McConnell in the Senate are the final say on what gets a vote on the House or Senate floor. Really, things can't move forward without their go-ahead. And so the majority matters. The House and Senate do function a little bit differently, where the majority has some more power in the House than they do in the Senate. And as a result of that, the House tends to pass more legislation than the Senate. The Senate rules give individual senators a little bit more power than House members have. One senator can't necessarily get anything done, but one senator can try and prevent something else from happening. And so you'll see kind of more contentious debate on legislation in House committees and on the Senate floor. Another quick key thing to highlight here about the Senate, and part of what makes it the more deliberative body, is the rules include something called the filibuster. So even though the Republicans hold the majority in the Senate, most legislation requires 60 votes to really move forward. There are some procedural tricks that you can use to avoid this requirement, but as a rule of thumb, you need 60 votes to get things done in the Senate. So, rarely does one party hold this majority and makes the Senate a little bit more deliberative and slow and thoughtful in their process. Everyone can argue whether or not it's truly thoughtful, but it is kind of a slower body. So the House gets quite frustrated that they pass all of these bills, hundreds of bills passed through the House each year, and then they just don't move forward in the Senate, so they don't become law. A little Washington is that the House-Senate divide is sometimes worse than the Democratic-Republican divide. So even though there's that House-Senate competitive dynamic, we certainly are living in a partisan atmosphere these days. Hard to know exactly what to attribute that to, but a couple things that I think add to it are gerrymandering and the gift ban. Most of you, I think, are from Pennsylvania, so you've heard about gerrymandering, where district lines are drawn to favor one constituency over another. And so over time, many districts across the country have become quote unquote safe districts for Democrats or safe districts for Republicans. And because they're safe districts, you get kind of stronger, more conservative Republicans kind of win those seats, or stronger, more progressive liberal Democrats win those seats. And so the people who are serving in Congress are not really closer to center. They tend to be some of the more extremes of either party. And so, as I said, in Pennsylvania, you all saw the perfect example of this. Over the 2000 and the 2010 census, Pennsylvania lost 2 congressional seats after the 2000 census and 1 seat after the 2010 census. So the lines were redrawn by the state assembly, and then they were challenged in court as being too partisan in violation of the Pennsylvania Constitution. The court actually agreed that they were partisanly drawn, and so the General Assembly and the governor were supposed to come up with a new map. It was a Democratic governor and a Republican assembly. They failed to reach agreement. So the Pennsylvania Supreme Court actually drew the congressional map that Pennsylvania operates under today. And that map, by the court's design, was supposed to have a pretty partisan balance of 10 Republican seats and 8 Democratic seats. And so the first time the new map was used was in the 2018 elections, where the delegation came out to be 9 Republicans, 9 Democrats. And kind of before that redistricting, it was 13 Republicans to 5 Democrats. And just briefly, the other thing that I think has sadly contributed to the partisanship in DC and the atmosphere is the gift ban. There used to be a time where outside groups could bring members of Congress together for meals and trips, and that has been severely restricted over time. And it's sad that members just don't get to know each other on their own if somebody else isn't footing the bill. And so there's much less socialization and getting to know each other as people, as opposed to only, fighting the battle in the hall of Congress.
Thanks, Kathleen. I think this is a perfect example of elections have consequences for what gets done and how things get done. So we'll spend just a minute on a little bit of an election preview. That's the current makeup of the House and Senate. We'll talk a little bit about our expectations for that. So starting with the House, all 435 seats are up in the House. That's just how they do it. They have to run every 2 years, all of them. As Kathleen noted, Democrats have the majority right now, so they'll be defending that majority. Republicans would need to net around 18 seats to flip the chamber for the next Congress, which is just pretty widely viewed as unlikely. A handful of factors are contributing to that, but the one that is I think less reported on and most interesting is just Republican House members have been retiring in droves, creates new opportunities for challengers and some of these more liberal or progressive candidates in districts that are historically conservative. Whenever there's an open seat, it is just that much more contentious versus an incumbent with good name ID that people recognize. So that's a lot of opportunity there for Democratic challengers to swoop into some of these open Republican seats. But some of the most closely watched races on the Democratic side are going to be, there's actually 31 House Democrats that represent districts where President Trump won in 2016 and then they won in 2018. So these are more moderate areas. These are areas that went for Trump and then went for a Democrat. So those are the more interesting races to watch. They're often ones that kind of swing back and forth with the presidential election cycle. And those are really the bulk of the seats that the Democrats will need to defend to keep their majority. Switching to the Senate, I think everyone's spending a little bit more time on the Senate because this is the body that's viewed most likely as contested. There are a number of open seats that are viewed as toss-ups, but just in general, there are 35 seats up this election. 22 of those 35 are Republican. So they have the burden of defense just broadly. That's expensive for them, time-consuming for them. There's just more Republican seats up and at risk. The Democrats would need to net 4 seats to take control of the Senate. If they only get 3, this is kind of a fun fact, they would also need to get the White House, because if there's a tie in the breakdown of the Senate, the majority is actually decided by the vice president's party. So if President Biden wins, former vice president becomes President Biden, and the Senate does not have enough to be a concrete majority, they only get 3 seats instead of 4. Vice President Harris would be the tie break, and it would be a Democratic Senate. But 4 is the number the Democrats would be aiming for to swing back that chamber. And of the 35 open seats, there are 8 that are really seen as the most vulnerable. Those are noted here on the slide. 7 of those are Republican, and 1 is Democratic. These are the battleground states. These are the races that you hear about all the time, even if you don't live in the state. The purple ones are the ones that are really viewed as toss-ups that are 50-50 depending on the day, and polling could kind of go either way, but each party has a seat that is likely to flip and go for the other party. So the first one is Senator Doug Jones. He's a Democrat in Alabama. That seat is viewed as likely to go Republican. The second is Senator McSally. She's a Republican in Arizona. That seat is likely to go Democrat. So those kind of net each other out, and then you're left with 6 that are definitely toss-ups. These are races to watch. And some of these are always races to watch in battleground states, but interestingly enough, there have been a few that have risen to this battleground swing state or swing seat level in more recent times. And I think COVID has had a big impact on that. The economy has shifted, dynamics have shifted with some of the social justice issues, some of the Supreme Court voting. There's just a few factors that have put races on the map in a way that they were not before. So let's say each party loses 1 seat, Democrats would need to flip 4 of these 6 remaining seats. So it's seen as a challenge, but certainly not out of the realm of possibility. What's going to really happen, I think, is the trickle-down effect, as it's called. Whoever's at the top of the ticket, if they're having a good night, they're likely to boost up the Senate candidate in that state. So if President Trump is having a great night in North Carolina, he's winning this state by quite a bit, incumbent Senator Tillis is likely to get a little bit of a bump from that. But these are the races to watch, and it'll be interesting. As Kathleen noted, the Senate, slow and deliberative, so these people get 6-year terms, and they have a big impact on what's going to get done. So House unlikely to flip, Senate maybe a little more likely to flip, we'll see. But I think conventional wisdom is that they're both a little bit more likely to stay, but we'll outline some scenarios later for what we can expect. Shifting gears a little bit, diving down into these races, I want to spend just a minute on some of the polling. This data here, the national presidential poll average, is as of yesterday. So things change pretty quickly, but generally not that quickly. This is pretty accurate. The wording here on the Biden slide that he is favored to win is really just the language of pollsters and reflects the fact that former Vice President Biden has been consistently leading President Trump by anywhere from 5 to 7 points in recent polls. Biden's lead has decreased slightly over the last few weeks. In August, he was leading by 8 to 11 points in most of these polls. It's worth noting that in 2016, Hillary Clinton was also leading then Republican nominee Donald Trump, but by a slightly narrower margin. As you can see in this graph at the bottom there, the gap has been shrinking. There's a lot of time left, 40 days, I think, to be exact, between now and November. And there's no shortage of surprises and time for things to pop up between now and then. Safe to say, all around, based on the data and just polling generally, that the race is tightening. We're getting to the peak ad season. Political ads are really ramping up in all of those battleground states and just across the country. Candidates are on the ground in battleground states every day. They're making their presence known and trying to get those elusive, undecided voters to decide their way. One important note, I guess I'll say about polling is that, to Kathleen's point about polarization, it just seems like polls are less accurate now than they used to be. I think we were all surprised in 2016 that none of the data matched the outcome a little. Everyone was surprised. All the news commentators were surprised. All the pollsters were surprised. But I think that's because most Americans now are not interested in sharing their politics. It's not a public discussion item. And if it is, it's oftentimes highly contentious. So we're having, I think pollsters, the industry is having a challenge with people not wanting to answer questions on the phone or not accurately representing where they stand. And polls can be skewed by that kind of information, of course, but also, if they only include registered voters versus likely voters, there are all these metrics that make polls a little bit less accurate, I think, than the American public used to like to believe that they were. Kathleen, do you have anything you want to add there? Because you've seen some races go different ways.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're going to turn to the Electoral College next. I think that the polls, some pollsters would say they did provide the scenario, or was within the error of margin, or the margin of error, excuse me, that Trump could have won, in 2016. Hillary did win the popular vote. So in that respect, the polls were accurate. But as we all know, the Electoral College is really how you get to the White House. So here's thanks, Anne. Here's a look at the Electoral College. So this is something that I think folks are paying a lot more attention to this year. This graph and the information is from the Cook Political Report, campaign-focused think tank, I guess you would call it, in Washington. It is from July, so this might change, but this was the latest information that they had available. So you need 270 electoral votes to win the White House. The Cook report ranks states by whether they are solid, likely, or lean to one party or another, or a toss-up. So in using that metric, Biden, according to the data that folks are tracking right now, would have 290 electoral votes over the 270. So he's got it. If everything in the solid, likely, and lean Democratic categories held to where folks are predicting today. And so he wouldn't need anything from the toss-up column. Whereas Trump has a little bit harder road to get there. If you add up all of the solid, likely, and lean Republican states for Donald Trump, he still needs 61 electoral votes from either the toss-up column or the lean Democrat, most likely lean Democratic column. So even if Biden loses a few of the lean Biden votes, he still has more path to 270 than Trump does right now. Obviously, as Anne was just saying, swing states and states with the large number of votes, like Pennsylvania, tend to be very popular amongst presidential candidates this time of year. And I'm sure you're all experiencing that. I think Biden or Trump or Pence, somebody has been in Pennsylvania every week for the past month or so. So we are all taking the polls with a grain of salt. As Anne noted, it is shrinking, tightening up as we get closer to the election. And even though we are all being inundated with political ads and voting has begun in many states, there still actually is a lot of time before Election Day. And anything could change. So we had our first potential game changer last Friday when Ruth Bader Ginsburg passed away. and created a vacancy on the Supreme Court. So given that we are a group of women here, and she was, this iconic leader for equal rights, I wanted to spend just a minute on her background before we get into the politics there. So as reported in recent days, and I'm sure you have all seen some of this, it was noted in 1971, a woman had trouble getting a credit card in her own name. That changed by law in 1974. A woman couldn't serve on a jury in most states, but that changed in 1975 via a Supreme Court ruling. A woman in the military couldn't get equal family housing or benefits for her husband. A Supreme Court decision changed that in 1973. The timing of those changes was no coincidence. In 1972, Ruth Bader Ginsburg began to direct the ACLU's Women's Rights Project. When she died, the ACLU noted that between 1969 and 1980, when Ginsburg left to join the federal bench, the group had participated in 2/3 of the gender discrimination cases decided by the Supreme Court. So that is just like some of her background before she even became a federal judge, let alone all of the, landmark Supreme Court cases where we know she offered either the majority opinion or often the dissenting opinion with her special dissent collar. So I just thought, as a group of women here today, that we should just kind of note some of what she has done for all of us over the years and during her lifetime. So we can get into kind of which party benefits from the SCOTUS opening. I think that Republicans, as we talked about earlier, are in the majority in the Senate, and so they really kind of control the schedule. So we'll see what impact this could have on the election and bringing out the vote. And then just a note here, where we think we're so close to the election. If we think back to 2016 and all of the, quote unquote, October surprises, some of which also happened in September. You remember the Access Hollywood tape, WikiLeaks coming out, Comey reopening his investigation and then reclosing it. That is all in the calendar yet to come. So, who knows what else is before us and what changes that could make to the upcoming election and voter turnout.
I think voter turnout is one of the most timely issues that we can cover right now, in addition to some of the other pure politics of it. Just the environment that we're operating in because of COVID has just fundamentally shifted the way that people are engaging with the electoral process this year and the way that people have to get out and exercise their right to vote. So appropriately, a lot of states have shifted their voting rules to reflect the COVID pandemic environment, and we expect much more mail-in voting. And with that, just more energy and time is being put into the voting processes and plans. The question of the day is, can states accommodate these absentee ballots? And that's really brought the United States Post Office into focus. I think we are all more confident now than we were a few weeks ago that the Postal Service can handle this mail volume, but it is important to be cognizant of the timing and the deadlines in your area, and really provide some additional time for people to mail in votes to ensure that they're counted. Because the way that elections work in this country, states are in control of the way that their elections are run. So there's really no way, I think appropriately so, but to harmonize those requirements across the state, which requires a heightened level of voter engagement. You just have to be aware, you have to be interested, you have to seek out the information to make sure your ballot is going to count. All of this, I think, has resulted in a little bit of voter angst and anxiety. But with everything that's going on, it seems that there's a little bit of a rallying effect for each party, which often happens in times of crisis. So I think COVID was a crisis that kind of shook the country. The Supreme Court nomination and the process thereof also has crisis-type implications, depending on your perspective and your party. Generally, rising job losses have just created a lot of pressure for the economy and people often in these battleground states. So even a handful of votes, a minor spike in voter turnout, can have a really huge impact on the outcome of the election. So that's my little stump speech for voting, but it's also front and center in the polling that we're doing, pollsters are doing, and just the way that people are thinking about the possible outcomes of this election. I'd be remiss not to note that there are some questions on when we'll know the timing of the election. When can we expect results? Because the environment is just so different. People are voting differently. In some cases, mail-in ballots are not due to the election offices until the Friday after election day. I think the important timeline there is it's going to be how decisive the margin of victory is. So if all of the outstanding votes to be counted or ballots to be reviewed are not enough to even come close to swinging it either way, I think we'll know more quickly. But if it's close and every single ballot needs to be counted, which they will be checked, but if there's such a margin of error that we really, really don't know, it could be certainly days and possibly weeks. We saw with the Bush v. Gore, there was a lot of debate and it ended up going to the Supreme Court, and we didn't have a decision in that election finally until December 12th. So that's a long way from election day. I hope that we're not in that same kind of situation, but it's good to be aware that we might not know as a country immediately. I'm curious to watch the news on the night and see what folks are saying. How much speculating can you do without all of the numbers? But I do think we got a good sampling of this from primaries. Most states handled their primary elections quickly. Results were in, but we did see a few outliers to that. I think of the New York State races. In some of those races, it was a few weeks before the primary candidate champion had emerged, and that's just at a one state level. So if we have 50 states doing this at the same time, there is some potential for a delay. A few factoids of note in this process are that Louisiana has what they call a jungle primary. So if someone doesn't get the majority on election day, there's a runoff. Georgia has the same kind of setup that necessitates a runoff. So some of these states themselves could be outliers for a little bit. But overall, I think it's important to just be aware of the voting deadlines and processes. Also important to note that mail-in ballots are safe. Election fraud is not rampant. That has been a political talking point quite a bit lately, but over a 20-year period, I mean, there are less than 1,000 instances of voter fraud. And then think about the millions of ballots cast in different elections over that time, so you should feel confident, but you should also make sure that you know what you're getting yourself into. You should make sure that you know the deadlines, the timing, where to go, and how to do it. So the earlier that we can be prepared, I think we all have a little bit more free time now, maybe, that we're working from home. Make sure you know the state requirements. And with that in mind, Kathleen's going to spend just a minute on some of the Pennsylvania deadlines, as we think a lot of people in this group that will be relevant to them.
As we've heard over the past couple of weeks, make a plan. Have a plan to vote, whether you're going to vote in person or by mail or in person early. Just make a plan to make sure that your vote is counted. So we pulled kind of what the Pennsylvania deadlines are here, and there have been changes over the past couple of years in Pennsylvania as well. So the deadline to register to vote is just under a month away on October 19th. The deadline for an application, so for the county election board to receive your application for an absentee ballot, that deadline is at the end of October on the 27th. There is no excuse to absentee voting now in Pennsylvania. And then, of course, election day is November 3rd. That is when an absentee ballot must be postmarked by, and then it must be received by the Friday after the election. So that's a change. Pennsylvania used to have the ballot had to be received the Friday before the election. So now it's the Friday after the election. There's no early voting in Pennsylvania. We've seen on the news some states already have polling places opened where you can go and vote and cast your vote in person now. So they don't call it early voting in Pennsylvania, but you can go to your county election office, or in some counties it might be a government agency office, and fill out a mail-in ballot in person. So it's kind of the same thing as early voting, but they don't call it that. And that is run by each of the county election boards. So you just have to check with your county to see, the hours and place for where you can do that. But we encourage everyone to vote.
All right, with all of that background in mind and your voter awareness, we just wanted to spend a minute here on what are seen widely as the most likely scenarios for the upcoming election. There's 4 of them here. Under some of these election scenarios, bipartisan legislative action is very possible. under others, it seems like gridlock, except for the times of crisis and emergencies, might be the status quo. But divided government, as Kathleen noted earlier, certainly creates legislative hurdles for both parties. So whether it's a blue wave or a red wave, that would be a more primed legislating scenario because all of the chambers and the White House would be in the same place. But for either of these divided government scenarios, there are a few key issues that would have to be tackled. I think economic recovery, COVID, no party can ignore those, but the path to legislating will look a little bit differently. Kathleen, do you want to talk a little bit about, I know we touched on Senate rules, but some of the expectations for some of these scenarios?
Yeah, sure. So, if there is just a change in the White House and you have the Senate, the House and the Senate not changing majorities, so you still have Pelosi and McConnell leading there, but with Biden, we could see some big items that haven't been able to get through in the past couple of years, not necessarily because of Trump, but just because they're due. So I think the country is in great need for a big infrastructure package. That's something that, if there's a sweep by either party or, we keep the status quo, we could see something on that in the next couple of years, I'd say a year maybe. If there is a Democratic sweep, I think you'll see a lot more of obviously the Democratic priorities. Some of the conversation that you've probably heard in the news is that if there's a sweep, that kind of 60 vote threshold and the filibuster is going to go away. The Democrats are going to add seats to the Supreme Court. They're going to kind of really change all the rules to their benefit. I would say that is all on the table. But regarding the filibuster, it's not going to be like a day one thing. I think that, Biden's perspective will be, he's a longtime senator. He has great respect for the body and its rules. It's kind of steeped in history. So I don't think he'll be pushing it. And there'll be a test vote, kind of the same way that we saw McConnell change the rules for justices. There'll be some proposal, whether it's infrastructure or, there was a bipartisan immigration proposal that passed the Senate a number of years ago that the House just never took up. But there'll be something that is marketed as a reasonable, moderate proposal. And if 60 votes can't be held and it's an important issue, there'll be a rule change at that time. So there'll be kind of like a testing out the waters before they make that change. The other thing to note is even if the Democrats do take the majority in the Senate, it will be because Democrats won in traditionally Republican seats. So think about, Montana, Iowa, South Carolina, North Carolina, these seats that have these states that have been traditionally red states. The Democrats, if they win from those states, will be a lot more moderate. So don't think that a Democratic majority in the Senate is going to be all of these liberal firebrands. It actually will be the majority, just like the House is operating today, will be won because of moderates. So I think that's just kind of important to note. If we're in the status quo, we're just going to see a lot more oversight. That the kind of investigations into Trump and his cabinet and others, I don't think will change. If there's a red wave and Trump wins re-election, the House, very unlikely, but if it flips and the Senate maintains, we'll just see kind of a sprint to the president's priorities. The Republican Senate, and I would expect the Republican House as well, to be very accommodating to Trump's agenda. And so think, maybe some more on China, trade, border wall, kind of those sorts of issues would come up. So no matter the outcome, we are in divided times here, and hopefully we'll still see some important legislation before the election.
to that point, there is a lot of time leading up to the election, like we've noted, and then also afterwards, while we know a new election outcome, there is a lame duck session where the current majorities are still in place and there is time for legislating. Just thinking about what that looks like heading up to the election, the House has already funded the government past the appropriation package with a short-term extension. So that's up. The House has done that, the Senate needs to act on that, and that goes through December 11th. So that's why appropriations will be up again after the election, because they need to figure out a more long-term solution to that. Also pre-election, as Kathleen noted, we'll talk more about, but there's a chance, there's certainly an interest from the president and Mitch McConnell in getting Supreme Court nominees nominated. So I think we could see some names tossed out as soon as this week, and then hearings are likely to begin in the Senate heading up to the election. After the election, we're likely to see another COVID relief package. I'm hopeful that we'll see another COVID relief package. That has really dominated all types of activity at the federal level this year. But actually, we haven't seen any fulsome legislation on this since March. We've seen Democratic proposals, Republican proposals, and neither of those have crossed the finish line into comprehensive legislation, despite some pretty broad agreement on topics. So we'll look towards that. Appropriations again, and then the National Defense Authorization Act has been passed every year for 70 years. So there's a lot of energy and desire to get that done. That's funding the military. So we don't expect them, again, fingers crossed, to drop the ball on that one. That will likely be a lame duck activity as well. Shifting to some of the things that we've seen and we may see more action on, I think Kathleen's just going to touch on some of the investment-specific policy areas quickly.
Yeah, so as Ann said, not a lot is happening this year, but Congress has paid attention to some issues that matter to this group. And I would expect next year for them to come back, even if they don't get across the finish line this year, particularly on ESG, the environmental, social, and governance issues, with particular attention on diversity and inclusion. And then there's a strong anti-China sentiment in Congress these days. So I just want to highlight a couple bills that fall under those two categories. Under ESG and diversity and inclusion specifically, there is draft legislation circulating. It's public. It's on the House Financial Services Committee website, but it hasn't been formally introduced. So it doesn't have a bill number. But it's called the Diverse Investment Advisors Act. This bill came up in June of last year. And when it was first released, the first discussion draft, it was described as a way to get more minority firms managing endowments and pension funds. And the way to do that would be to institute the Rooney Rule. Some of you may be familiar with the Rooney Rule from the NFL. In this context, it basically would be that any company, public company, who is looking to have their money managed must interview at least one qualified minority firm when doing so. So sounds good, nothing to complain about there. Who could disagree with that? But as drafted, it actually would have impacted the annual Section 15 renewal process between a mutual fund and its investor. And through this process, I kind of, I'm not the mutual fund contract attorney here. I didn't even know about Section 15, but I've gotten to be very familiar with it. Basically, the impact would have been that every fund, every year, would have put out to bid who would serve as its advisor. So take, ABC company offers an S&P 500 fund. Every year, that company would have to put out for bid who would manage and advise on those investments. And as you all know, some of those are proprietary. You have your name attached to them. You're not really looking for somebody else to do the work. And part of the name recognition is what draws investors into the fund. So you definitely want to have your brand on there. So we've worked as an industry pretty closely with the committee in trying to change and improve that legislation. So still not introduced, as I said, but we are on the 6th draft of the bill. And it only applies to funds when you are changing an unaffiliated sub-advisor, which that change would not be subject to a shareholder vote. And it doesn't impact that annual renewal process at all. So this is not something we expect to get across the finish line this year, but I think there's been enough attention and focus on it and a real desire by House Financial Services Committee Chairwoman Maxine Waters, and there's a D&I subcommittee to that committee, and the Chairwoman Joyce Beatty there. It's definitely a big focus of theirs, and so I expect it to come back. The other bill to highlight in the diversity and inclusion space is the Improving Corporate Governance Through Diversity Act. So this would require issuers to disclose the race, ethnicity, gender, and veteran status of boards of directors, nominees to the board, and executive officers. And that disclosure is required annually and in any statement relating to the election of directors filed with the SEC. The bill also has the SEC create a diversity advisory group to identify strategy to increase diversity amongst boards, and those kind of reports from that new group at the SEC would be published annually. So this bill passed the House in November of last year on a pretty strong vote. It was 281 to 135, so about 50 Republicans also supported it. But the Senate has not taken up many of these diversity and inclusion bills at all. And so in an effort to get this bill across the finish line, as Anne was saying, the National Defense Authorization Act, the NDAA, is considered must-pass legislation. And so what the House did is they added this bill in whole as an amendment to that NDAA bill. So it's now attached to that. It has passed the House on its own and as part of the House NDAA bill. So they're doing what they can to see if we can get that across the finish line. And then there's this strong anti-China, bipartisan, bicameral House and Senate sentiment. So there are a number of proposals addressing China that have been introduced. And they're really in four main buckets. There are delisting bills. There are bills addressing the federal retirement plan, so retirement plans for federal employees and where those investments go. The Hong Kong Autonomy Act, I put in a category of itself. And then there's kind of like a catch-all, and it's mostly bills addressing China's role and response to COVID-19. So I'll touch on two of the bills in that area. The Holding Foreign Companies Accountable Act is commonly referred to as the China delisting bill. And it basically prohibits the trading of securities of foreign companies on a US exchange or over the counter whose audited financial statements cannot be reviewed by the Public Company Accounting Oversight Board, PCAOB, for 3 consecutive years. So if PCAOB does not have access to the audit, you're kicked off the exchange. You're no longer traded in the US. It passed the Senate unanimously in May. And then there's strong support for it in the House, but due to COVID and this kind of like remote work and hybrid hearings, it just was impractical for the bill to go through the committee process, which is a necessary step. So again, instead, the House added it to the NDAA bill. So those two bills are attached to the House NDAA bill. They are not in the Senate NDAA bill. And because there is this strong desire to keep that record going, and the NDAA gets done every year, I could see the House and Senate Armed Services Committee kind of negotiating that down to kind of just the core elements of what is really like part of the NDAA. So those bills could be stripped out. I do think just due to the strong bipartisan support for the delisting bill, that could become law, a little bit stronger possibility than the diversity bill. But the diversity issues, I think, will continue and could come up again next year. I would also just note that the administration is also interested in the delisting issue. The President's Working Group on Financial Markets issued a report in August, as requested by the President, making recommendations to, quote, protect investors from Chinese companies that do not comply with US securities laws and investor protections. And so one recommendation coming out of that report is delisting Chinese companies that don't comply with PCAOB auditing standards. And the timeline in that recommendation, rather than 3 consecutive years from the legislation, is that as of January 2022, they'd be kicked off. So whether it's through SEC taking action or legislation, I think the delisting bill has a good chance of enactment. The Hong Kong Autonomy Act has already been signed into law, passed both houses. The President signed it on July 14th. This, I think, is interesting to this group as well. The bill imposes sanctions on foreign individuals and entities that, quote, materially contribute to China's failure to preserve Hong Kong's autonomy. And so the law requires the Department of State to report on foreign individuals and entities that materially contribute to China's actions with regard to Hong Kong, and 2, foreign financial institutions that knowingly conduct a significant transaction with anybody identified as contributing to China's actions. So the president can then impose sanctions, and this is just something that, as members of the financial services industry, we want to pay close attention to. I'm sure all of your companies have strong compliance departments, and Walter, as the general counsel, is probably has to look at this as well. But this is something that everybody just has to be cognizant of. So I wanted to highlight it.
Thanks, Kathleen. Maybe we spend just a minute on this so we can get to a question or two. There's just a lot of content to talk about here. But there's been, I guess, to this point, and Kathleen, I'll let you touch on these, there's been a flurry of activity on all of these issues in both the past administration and this current one. I think depending on who takes the White House and what the makeup of government is, we can expect either more of the same or a swing back to what we had seen previously. DC has this phrase that's often repeated: personnel is policy. So whoever they put in place to head these regulatory agencies has a huge impact on what gets done and how it gets done. And while these agencies have their jurisdiction, there is, of course, a little bit of a political bent in some cases to the way that they promulgate rules or the way that they choose to roll back rules, excuse me. Kathleen, do you want to just maybe handicap the fiduciary rule, Reg BI, and give like a quick overview of those?
Yeah, so the Obama administration's Department of Labor issued a fiduciary rule that became very controversial. It was challenged in court and kicked out. So then fast forward, and the SEC issued Regulation Best Interest, or Reg BI as it's known, and the DOL revived and issued a new fiduciary rule that's supposed to work in tandem and alongside Reg BI. Because that was such a big fight, so to speak, there is a possibility that if Biden were to win the White House, there could be some looking at the old rule, kind of evaluating the current rules to see if they do the trick. I will note that because the court kind of kicked that rule out and defanged it, the Biden administration wouldn't be able to propose the same exact rule, but they might try and do something closer to what the previous DOL did. Then, just highlighted here are some of the other rules that have come out recently that might be of interest to this group. DOL proposal on retirement plans and ESG investing. That's something that, as Anne was saying, with administrations going back and forth since the Clinton administration, generally each administration has made slight modifications to DOL's guidance on ESG investments in ERISA plans. And then the other SEC rules here on requirements and resubmission thresholds for shareholder proposals, that just came out yesterday. ESG disclosure is something that the SEC has discussed in many settings, and it's not clear exactly where they would go, but there are 2 rules that we expect to see this year where they could touch on the issue in some form or fashion. They may be motivated to do something this year, especially if they think the election is in doubt and there might be a new SEC next year. So happy to chat about any of those later, but we'll kind of move on since time is short here.
Thanks, Kathleen. I think our hosts have graciously agreed to give us 5 extra minutes because we just had so much to talk about. So we will get to a little bit of our moderated Q&A. And I'm going to leave Walter, it's like a speed round, whatever you think is most interesting. I tried to respond to 1 or 2 in the chat, and it seems like a few got scooped up in our content. So hopefully people feel good about those. And maybe, Walter, if you want to kick things off, that'd be great.
Well, I think first I'll kick it off with the results of our poll. So people might be interested in where it came out. So in the answer to the question, who will you vote for this year? 86% of you said you were going to vote for former Vice President Joe Biden. 86%, 12% for Trump, and 2% other. So I think that's fascinating to me. Who do you think will win? 67% of you said that Joe Biden will win, and 33% for Trump winning. And then finally in Pennsylvania, talk about a swing state, so close here even in our poll, 48% for Trump, 52% for Biden. So I think that's probably within the margin of error, so I want to call it a toss-up there. So very interesting results of our little mini poll there. So in terms of questions, I think maybe I'll start with the ones we got from the audience. One person asked, we heard from the pollsters in 2016 and they were wrong. Why should we believe that they'd be right this year in 2020? What has changed with the sort of science of polling that we should think of it as being more reliable this year? Has anything changed?
I'll start. I think that pollsters have definitely tried to improve their systems. Polling is only as good as the person responding to the poll and whether or not they answer truthfully and then follow through on what they say. So, polling is not a science. It's not a predictor. It's just trying to get a sense of what may happen. I think that, there is a lot more effort now to use social media and web pages and accessing people through text messages and websites as opposed to calling their home number. I think everybody has caller ID these days and does not pick up the phone. And so therefore pollsters weren't really maybe getting through to as many people as they had hoped in 2016, and they're making, stronger efforts to try and do so now. And then I think it's just, sample size and making sure, as Anne talked about during the presentation, that you do reach out to likely voters as opposed to just registered voters who might not actually go to the polls. And so it's kind of, they're less predictive of what the outcome might be. So yeah, you have to take it with a grain of salt. I don't know if you should trust them or not, honestly. You just have to take polls for what they are.
Right. So they may be wrong again. Maybe wrong again this year.
Yeah.
Okay. So I think we touched on ESG earlier, but we do have a question about ESG. And one of the issues that people are focusing on is that there's a lack of consistency or precision around terminology used in standards for what is an ESG investment and what isn't. Do you foresee any regulatory action in this space? I know you touched on the fact that maybe the House was even looking at this, but how about on a regulatory level?
Yeah, so that was part of the last slide that we rushed through there. The SEC definitely has received petitions and discussed ESG disclosure in a number of forums. They have an asset management advisory committee, and it's been on the agenda there numerous times. Chairman Clayton has said with regard to ESG that material information can be both financial and non-financial. Commissioner Pierce, one of the Republican members on the commission, has said ESG disclosure is unnecessary, while a Democratic commissioner has said asset managers should have access to all critical information so that they can make informed decisions for their investments. So the SEC is not all in the same place on exactly how they would tackle the issue, but they could be motivated to do something if the commission might change hands in a Biden administration. There are two rules that we expect to see this year: the funds disclosure rule and the fund names rule, where they could address ESG in some form or fashion. It is something that Congress has paid a lot of attention to, and there are numerous bills about different disclosures, whether it's human capital, diversity, as we talked about, climate risk, all sorts of different things. And so ICI, for one, and I think the industry is trying to get ahead of it. And ICI convened a working group and put out like a white paper on terminology that could be used by funds. So we're trying to kind of drive where things go as opposed to rules being imposed on us. But we certainly could see something, maybe not on ESG only and specifically, but they could touch on it in some other rules that we expect to see.
The only point I'll add there before we break is I just think that's an area ripe for industry leadership. It's always easier to kind of shape what things look like or play a hand in that before it is required of you and written in stone. So I know ICI has taken a leadership role there, and I encourage anyone that is worried about this or thinking about this to really think about the ways that you can engage and make this more of a public-private partnership and more of a dialogue before things come down from the top. I think we're in a place where we can influence the direction in a helpful manner, you know, with your shareholder information, what you're hearing from your investors, and some of just the industry best practices. So to the extent that that's something to lean in on, I would make that recommendation to the group because it's not a trend. It is definitely here to stay.
Okay, I want to be respectful of people's time. So Lori and Colleen, I think we're over our 5-minute extra that you gave us. So happy to close things out at this point if you want to break for the networking.
Yeah, we'll break for the networking, and maybe you'll be lucky enough to get Anne or Kathleen in or Walter in one of your groups. You can pepper them with questions then instead of introducing yourself. I'm just kidding. Or not. There are no rules in these breakout sessions. With that, I'll hand it off to Colleen. You're going to get a message asking you if you want to join the group. If you don't want to join the group, just don't join, and you'll stay in the lobby with Colleen. So it's a voluntary assignment, and then at the end, I think we're going to keep it a little bit shorter. It's going to be about I think 10 minutes to kind of keep everyone so that they can go back to their families before 6. With that, I'm going to hand it off to Colleen. When the groups are done, you can either let go or you can, we'll just say a few words at the end, but mostly those words are going to be like, have a good night. So see you in